Welcome to the Piano Sonatas of Beethoven. This is Lecture 1, and it is entitled Beethoven and the Piano. Beethoven published 32 piano sonatas. They span the length of his compositional career, having been written between early 1795, a few months after he turned 24, and January of 1822, a few weeks after he turned 51. His 32 piano sonatas were, for Beethoven, particularly special works. You see, Beethoven was a piano player. The piano was his axe, his voice, his entree to the greater musical world. He improvised for hours at the piano. He conceptualized essential musical ideas and compositional innovations at the piano. Literally, he spoke through the piano. Now, clearly, we can't hear Beethoven's actual speaking voice, dead as he was, 50 years before the invention of recorded sound. But we hear his voice if we listen carefully to his solo piano music. The idiosyncratic nature of his musical grammar and pianism, the mercurial, often stop-on-a-dime flow of ideas, the veritable flood of information, the manner in which musical ideas take off in tangents to be reconciled and explained further down the road, the juxtapositions of coarsely comic with deeply expressive and sometimes even tragically painful music, the sheer, breathtaking spontaneity of it. My friends, Beethoven's piano music is his voice, emerging from his mind, through his fingers, to our ears and our hearts. Beethoven's piano sonatas are, more than any other of his amazing works, his personal testament expressed in his own voice. And Beethoven's piano sonatas also capture, as do his symphonies and string quartets, his ongoing compositional development and his evolving views regarding musical expression. In his early sonatas, we'll discuss Beethoven's compositional evolution relative to the classical style that was, after all, his artistic inheritance. But increasingly, as his musical trajectory goes above and beyond the horizon of classicism, we will find it increasingly difficult to relate his music to the classical tradition. Once we get to the last 5 piano sonatas, from Opus 101 of 1816 on, well, we'll have to accept Beethoven's piano sonatas as being self-referential, essentially unrelated to any norm or convention, as being intrinsically and exclusively themselves. Our goals for this first of our 24 lectures are as follows. First, I'd like us to get a sense of what sort of person Beethoven actually was. Next, we'll need to investigate, briefly but energetically, the early history of the piano and Beethoven's relationship with the pianos of his time. Finally, we'll discuss the particular recordings of Beethoven's piano sonatas that we are privileged to use in this course. Beethoven, some reflections on the man himself. In terms of his attitudes and actions, Ludwig van Beethoven was a remarkably modern man. His spirited mistrust, isn't that a nice way to put it? His spirited mistrust of authority, his skepticism, his self-absorption and self-reliance, and his unshakable conviction regarding the absolute rightness of his artistic actions, whether or not they coincided with or subscribed to any pre-existing tradition, strike us as exceedingly contemporary, very 21st century. From both a personal and professional point of view, he was a man who thought outside of the box at a time when very few other people even perceived the existence of a box. Now, despite the fact that he composed the single greatest religious composition of the 19th century, the Missa Solemnis, Opus 123 of 1823, Beethoven did not believe in organized religion. We are told that, although the last sacraments were administered to him on his deathbed, and he remained formally a Roman Catholic, Beethoven had little use for organized religion, was suspicious of the feudal hierarchy of the church, and was spiritually subversive enough to be described by Haydn as an atheist. Neither did Beethoven believe in the divine right of kings, princes, or their aristocratic minions. For example, In 1806, furious with his friend and longtime patron, Prince Karl von Lichnowsky, for reasons we'll discuss later in the course, Beethoven wrote this in a letter to the prince, and we quote, "Prince, what you are by birth and accident. What I am by my own doing. There are and always will be thousands of princes, but there is only one Beethoven," unquote. What Beethoven did believe in, like Mozart before him, was art and himself. And like Mozart, he would seem to have been that rare artistic bird who harbored virtually no self-doubt. Like Mozart before him and Franz Liszt after him, Beethoven believed that his genius ennobled him and made him the equal of any man or woman. And in this he was, of course, entirely correct. We're not going to delve into the details of Beethoven's early life here in this course. For that, I would direct your attention to my teaching company, Great Masters Biography of Beethoven. Suffice it for now that Beethoven grew up in Bonn, hard and fast, and that the abuse he sustained at the hands of his father and his mother's death when he was just 16 left him an angry and alienated survivor. His formal education ended at the tender age of 10, and he retained, we might even say he cultivated, the rough edge of a self-educated man from the boonies until the day he died. In 1811, when Beethoven was in his 31st year, Schneider von Wartensee wrote to the Zurich-based publisher Hans Nageli that while, and we quote, "while great thoughts drift through Beethoven's mind, he cannot express them in any form but music. He has no command over words. His whole education has been neglected, and apart from his art, he is coarse, but honest and unaffected. He says quite bluntly, whatever he may be thinking," unquote. Yeah, Beethoven's coarseness played itself out in any number of different ways. In his general attitude, in his legendary rudeness, and even his physical relationship with the world. According to his friend and student, Ferdinand Ries, Beethoven was, and we quote, "awkward and helpless. His uncouth movements were destitute of all grace. He seldom took anything into his hands without dropping or breaking it. Thus he frequently knocked over his inkwell into the pianoforte. No piece of furniture was safe from him, least of all costly pieces. Everything was overturned, soiled, and destroyed. It's hard to comprehend how he managed to shave himself, even leaving out of consideration the number of cuts on his cheeks," unquote. Well, needless to say, Beethoven was a terrible dancer and the worst housekeeper this side of Felix Unger. And while he never said anything about his dancing, Beethoven himself admitted that his housekeeping was, and we quote, "very much like an allegro di confusione," unquote, loosely translated as an endless confusion. Putting it all together, the Viennese physician Anton Schmith said rather unkindly that the mature Beethoven was, and we quote, "as freakish as he is unserviceable," unquote. Oh, a comment that begs us to remind the good Herr Dr. Schmith that it could have been worse, that Beethoven could have been dating his daughter. Beethoven was just one of those people whose talent and force of personality left a swath of disarray in their tracks. In 1812, in a letter to Friedrich Zelter, the great Johann von Goethe himself described Beethoven as, and we quote Goethe, "an unlicked bear who found the world despicable but does not thereby render it any the pleasanter, either for himself or for other people," unquote. Now, for all his faults, Beethoven was a man of extraordinary moral idealism and self-knowledge. In 1793, at the age of 22 and a half or so, he wrote in a friend's autograph album, and we quote, "I am not wicked, my crime is youth. Wicked I am not, though wild upsurgings often plead against my heart. My heart is good. To help wherever one can, love liberty above all things, never deny the truth, even at the foot of the throne," unquote. Now, according to Dieter Hilbrandt, in Vienna, Beethoven had gradually established his fame and notoriety with 3 strokes of genius. his impetuous virtuosity at the keyboard, his unprecedented talent for improvisation, and his rudeness, which must have reminded civilized Vienna of that archetypal character of the 18th century novel, The Noble Savage, unquote. Yes, an unlicked bear Beethoven absolutely was. As an example of Beethoven's legendary rudeness, an anecdote, one of the legion of such anecdotes, my friends, that document Beethoven's less than politic behavior. Sometime during the first years of the 19th century, Beethoven was performing at the home of Count Moritz Fries, one of the richest men in all of Vienna. The cream of Viennese society attended these musicales at Chez Fries. The Schwarzenbergs, the Kinskys, the Lichtensteins, the Lobkowitzes, the Lichnowskis, the Razumovskys. Big money, old money, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Gettys of their time. Anyway, Beethoven was playing a march four-handed with his student Ferdinand Ries when the future director of the Royal Theatre, Count Ferdinand Palffy, who was standing in the back of the room by the door, said something to the woman standing next to him. Now please, in an age when aristocratic patrons generally considered house music to be a foil for conversation, this would have been considered standard behavior in any salon. But not in the presence of Beethoven. According to one account, and we quote, "What happened next was a revolutionary act, a verbal guillotine. Beethoven swept the hands of his student Ries from the keyboard, sprang up from the instrument, and shouted at the festive company, 'I do not play for such swine!'" For seconds, there was absolute utter silence. The piano mute, the chattering count struck dumb. According to Ries, the audience attempted to appease Beethoven. All attempts to bring him back to the piano were in vain, and he would not even allow me to play the next piece on the program. So on a note of general discord, the music stopped. "I do not play for such swine," a statement of impassioned rage, spoken in fury, yet also, at the beginning of the 19th century, a political protest. Not just an expression of revolt aimed at the nobility, but also a bid for autonomy on behalf of music and music makers. For Beethoven, music was no longer a decoration, an oral ornament donned by a room. For Beethoven, music demanded that society be all ears and respectfully silent. For Beethoven, music would no longer frame a social event. It insisted upon being the event itself. Beethoven was a revolutionary man living at a revolutionary time, and he believed completely that music was part of that revolution. It is exactly this revolutionary spirit that the philosopher Theodor Adorno addressed when he wrote that, and we quote Adorno, "If Beethoven the man is already the musical prototype of the revolutionary bourgeoisie, his music is also the prototype of a music that has thrown off its social obligations, a fully autonomous aesthetic, no longer in service of anyone. The essence of society becomes in him the essence of music itself," unquote. Wilfrid Mellers suggests that, and now we quote Professor Mellers, "Beethoven was part of history, and history in the making. His music renders incarnate truths that philosophers discuss abstractly, revealing the reality of his age at a level of which it couldn't otherwise be intellectually conscious," unquote. Beethoven and the piano. The constantly changing technology of the piano affected the way Beethoven thought about and composed for the piano. His creative life corresponded precisely with the development of the piano from a small, portable, wooden-harped, 5-octave keyboard instrument considered still something of a toy. In 1774, the great Voltaire referred to the piano as merely a tinker's pot to the big, heavy, iron-harped pianos with which we are familiar today. The two great innovations that together contributed to creating the modern piano both occurred during Beethoven's lifetime, although we should note that Beethoven himself never had the opportunity to actually play pianos equipped with these innovations. The innovations were the French manufacturer Erard's double escapement action, introduced in 1821, and the Boston-based Alpheus Babcock's one-piece cast iron frame, introduced in 1825. Erard's action allowed for extremely rapid repetition of notes, and Babcock's cast iron frame allowed for more and thicker strings, which produced a bigger, more sonorous sound. Oh, Beethoven would have loved the iron-framed piano, which was so much closer to his ideal instrument. So while the constantly changing technology of the piano affected the way Beethoven thought about and composed for the piano, it's also accurate to say that he was never particularly happy with the instruments he actually owned and played, aware as he was of their limitations, their limited registral range, their limited dynamic range, that is, their ability to get loud and soft, their limited ability to sustain, their relatively quiet tone, and their propensity to turn to kindling and chopsticks under his admittedly heavy touch. The invention of the piano. By the late 17th century, the harpsichord had been the standard portable keyboard instrument of choice for hundreds of years. The harpsichord is simply a horizontal harp in which the strings are plucked by a plectrum activated by a lever, a key, rather than directly by the fingers. As a result of its mechanism, the harpsichord is incapable of getting progressively louder and softer, and of accenting, that is, making some notes louder than others. The harpsichord is characterized by a brittle timbre, very, very fast attack and decay of its sound, and almost no ability to sustain. When the late and great English conductor Sir Thomas Beecham likened the sound of the harpsichord to two skeletons copulating on a tin roof, he was not being kind, but he was being accurate. In 17th century Italy, in a musical community increasingly preconditioned by the vocal expressivity of opera on one hand and the violin on the other, the limitations of the harpsichord became increasingly troublesome. The Italian composer Giovanni Cassini expressed the opinion of many when he wrote that music should consist of, and we quote Cassini, music should consist of the speech of the heart, now with the delicate touch of an angel, now with the violent eruptions of passion. Regrettably, the harpsichord cannot fulfill all the expressions of human sentiment, unquote. All right, enter the harpsichord builder, Bartolomeo Cristofori. Born in Padua in 1655, he was hired around 1688 by Prince Ferdinand de' Medici of Florence to both maintain the family's harpsichords and build new ones. It was there, in Florence, where opera was born back in 1600, that Cristofori invented the piano exactly 100 years later. Cristofori eliminated the dynamic shortcomings of the harpsichord by creating the first successful hammer-driven mechanism, calling his new keyboard instrument a gravicembalo col pianoforte, literally a big harpsichord with soft, piano, and loud, forte, a pianoforte, a soft loud. Thanks to research done by the Italian musicologist Mario Fabri, we now know that Cristofori built his first forte piano, his first loud soft, around 1700, not in 1709, as had previously been thought. Oh, what's 9 years among friends, right? Well, for piano aficionados, it's a big deal, and we must admit that the temporal symmetry of the first piano being built 100 years after the first opera was performed in the same city is more than just a little bit pleasing. We are not going to explore the technological development of the early piano during the early and mid-18th century. Suffice it that the piano didn't really begin to replace the harpsichord as the essential keyboard instrument of choice until the 1760s and 1770s, and did not completely replace the harpsichord until the early 19th century. Both Mozart, who was born in 1756, and Beethoven, who was born in 1770, first learned to play on a harpsichord, although Beethoven made the switch to the piano at a much younger age than did Mozart. The sort of piano Beethoven played as a kid would have been of German manufacture, very likely one built by either Franz Jakob Spaeth in Regensburg or Johann Andreas Stein in Augsburg. It would have had 61 keys, a range of 5 octaves, from the F 2.5 octaves below middle C to the F 2.5 octaves above middle C. It would have been double strung, meaning that most of the hammers struck 2 strings tuned to the same pitch, as opposed, my friends, to modern pianos, which are triple strung. It would have used an action, a mechanism, directly descended from Bartolomeo Cristofori's, an action called variously a German or Viennese action, one that featured a very shallow key drop and required an extremely light touch. The music written for these pianos was but one step removed from harpsichord music. It was piano music that stressed brilliance but did not call for big sounds or loud attacks or long sustained tones, like, for example, the piano music of Muzio Clemente and Wolfgang Mozart. Let's hear the beginning of Mozart's Piano Sonata in D major of 1789, played on just such an early piano, or forte piano, one built in Vienna by Johann Schanz in 1790. When playing music like this on a piano like the Schanz, one must sit upright at the center of the keyboard and play with a maximum of finger and wrist movement and a minimum of arm, shoulder, and back movement, lest fine control be lost and the keys be struck too hard. Now let's listen to a bit of the third movement of Beethoven's first published piano sonata, his sonata in F minor, Opus 2, number 1, completed in 1795, just 6 years after the Mozart sonata we just sampled. This is not just brilliant music, but vicious music, and it demands a degree of explosive percussivity and sonority that would have made a Viennese piano builder quake in his boots and the piano itself beg for mercy. We hear this movement played on a modern replica of an instrument built in 1795 by Jean-Louis Dolken of Munich. Be advised, the extraneous noises we hear on our recording are not the piano beginning to disintegrate, but the pianist. Clearly, from the very beginning, Beethoven demanded a sheer volume and power from the piano as an instrument that no one before him had ever demanded. And I would point out something else. It's no more possible to play music the likes of which we just heard, sitting still at the center of the keyboard and using only the wrist and fingers, than it is to sumo wrestle using only one's tongue. That's full contact piano music, my friends. Style, elegance, and fine control be damned. From the moment he arrived in Vienna in late November or early December of 1792, Beethoven put the piano-crazed Viennese on their ears. Beethoven, whose first paying job back in Bonn was as an organist, was undoubtedly trying to wrest from the lightweight Viennese pianos of the time the same degree of power, of sonority, and orchestral range of color that he could from a pipe organ. Good luck. Now, while Beethoven's extraordinary approach to the piano helped develop his reputation as a piano virtuoso, it did not endear him to everyone, in particular piano builders. For example, in his essay, Brief Remarks on the Playing, Tuning, and Maintenance of the Forte Piano, the piano builder Andreas Streicher discussed two nameless pianists. According to Streicher, the first pianist, and here he was undoubtedly referring to Muzio Clementi, is, and we quote Streicher, a true musician who has learned to subordinate his feelings to the limits of the instrument, so that he is able to make us feel what he himself feels, unquote. Now, the other pianist, undoubtedly referring to Beethoven, is, according to Streicher, and again we quote, unworthy of imitation, a player of whom it is said he plays extraordinarily, like you have never heard before, sits down, or rather throws himself at the fortepiano. Already the first chords will have been played with such violence that you wonder whether the player is deaf. Through the movement of his body, arms, and hands, he seemingly wants to make us understand how difficult is the work he has undertaken. He carries on in a fiery manner and treats his instrument like a man who is bent on revenge, has his arch-enemy in his hands, and with cruel relish wants to torture him slowly to death. He pounds so much that suddenly the maltreated strings go out of tune. Several fly towards bystanders, who hurriedly move back in order to protect their eyes. He makes only harsh sounds, and we hear only a disgusting mixture of tones. Is this description exaggerated? Certainly not, unquote. Now, Streicher was not alone in his criticism of Beethoven the pianist. In 1805, the pianist and composer Camille Pleyel wrote, and we quote, "At last I've heard Beethoven play a sonata of his composition. He has unlimited flair, but he has no schooling, and his execution is not polished. That is, his playing is not unblemished. He has a lot of fire, but pounds too much. He manages diabolical difficulties, but he does not play them altogether precisely," unquote. The Italian composer and pedant Luigi Cherubini bluntly and simply said in 1805 that Beethoven's piano playing was, and we quote, rough, unquote. And Muzio Clementi, himself one of the great pianists of his generation, commented that, quote, Beethoven's playing was not polished and was frequently impetuous, like himself, unquote. Now, clearly, neither Andreas Streicher, Camille Pleyel, Luigi Cherubini, nor Muzio Clementi understood what Beethoven was all about. But some very influential Viennese were utterly fascinated by both Beethoven the man and Beethoven the musician. Wealthy musical connoisseurs like Baron Gottfried von Swieten and Prince Karl Lichnowsky, who had a taste for difficult, serious music, actually encouraged Beethoven's predisposition towards musical experimentation and novelty. As a result, once he settled in Vienna, Beethoven never had to appeal to either the conservatives or to the larger musical public. Beethoven's pianos. The musicologist William Newman has identified 14 pianos that Beethoven owned or borrowed during his lifetime, and notes that he might very well have owned others besides. What Imelda Marcos was to shoes, so Beethoven was to pianos, an inveterate consumer, seeking and yet never finding the perfect instrument. Once he became famous, Beethoven rarely, if ever, had to buy his own pianos, as piano builders vied with each other to lend him instruments. Oh, like a contemporary professional athlete wearing a swoosh, Beethoven's use of a particular piano came to be considered a priceless endorsement. In 1802, Beethoven wrote, and we quote, "The whole tribe of pianoforte manufacturers have been swarming around me in their anxiety to serve me. Each of them wants to make me a pianoforte exactly as I should like it," unquote. In 1810, Beethoven wrote Andreas Streicher, asking for a piano. Now, this would be the same Andreas Streicher who had written the anonymous description of Beethoven at the piano 10 years before. By 1810, Herr Streicher had realized that whether or not he personally liked Beethoven's playing was immaterial. Business was business. And by 1810, Beethoven was the bomb. "Either Beethoven plays one of my pianos or one of my competitors' pianos. Better he should play mine." Anyway, Beethoven wrote to Streicher, and we quote, "You promised to let me have a piano by the end of October, and now we are already halfway through November, and as I have not yet received one, my motto is either play on a good instrument or not at all. I wait. All good wishes if you send me a pianoforte. If not, then all bad wishes," unquote. The Streicher piano Beethoven asked for and received was considerably larger and more resonant than the replica of the 1795 Dolken we heard a few minutes ago. Let's listen to a performance of the opening of the first movement of Beethoven's Piano Sonata in C major, Opus 53, the Waldstein Sonata of 1804, played on a replica of a Streicher built in 1814. Big music, my friends, and a bigger piano on which to realize the conception of this big music. It begs the chicken or egg question. Did Beethoven imagine his ever grander, more magnificent piano works because evolving piano technology made such works imaginable? Or did Beethoven's music force piano manufacturers to build bigger pianos, instruments more appropriate to music he had already composed? Well, I would suggest a little bit of each. Certainly, Beethoven was influenced by developing piano technology, but he was always 4, 5, or 6 steps ahead of that technology at any given point. This is especially true in Beethoven's most avant-garde piano sonatas, the final 5, opuses 101, 106, 109, 110, and 111, which were composed after he was clinically deaf and no longer performing as a pianist. In these last sonatas, he was no longer composing for a contemporary instrument, if he ever had been, but rather for an idealized instrument, an piano, an instrument whose range, power, and sonority simply did not yet exist. Beethoven owned two pianos at the end of his life, a 6-octave English Broadwood and a Viennese Graf. The Broadwood had been a gift from the manufacturer back in 1818, and the Graf a gift from its manufacturer in 1825. Much, and perhaps too much, has been written about the Broadwood, serial number 7362, which has become the single most famous piano in all of music history. Beethoven received it while he was working on the piano sonata in B-flat major, Opus 106, the so-called Hammer-Klavier Sonata, and the Broadwood has been credited incorrectly, as we will discuss in Lecture 21, with inspiring both the sonata and the new approach to the piano that it represents. The fact that Beethoven's Broadwood piano was later owned by Franz Liszt and can today be seen and even occasionally heard in the Budapest National Museum has helped to romanticize this particular instrument and magnify its importance way past the truth. The truth, while English pianos like the Broadwood were indeed larger and more resonant, they were triple-strung as opposed to the double-strung Viennese instruments, Beethoven found the so-called English action, a sort of action favored by French manufacturers as well, to be extremely stiff and unresponsive. Of Beethoven's 14 documented pianos, 11 were of Viennese manufacture, 1 came from Hungary, that's a Vogel piano, and 2 were sent as gifts from abroad, an Erard from Paris and the Broadwood from London. Rather than his Broadwood, it was Beethoven's Viennese Graf that in his lifetime came closest to his ideal piano. Let's listen to the opening of the first movement of Beethoven's Hammer-Klavier Sonata of 1818, played on an instrument built by the Viennese manufacturer Conrad Graf in 1824. A word about our recordings. During this course, we will have the privilege of hearing Claude Frank's recordings of the Beethoven piano sonatas played on a modern Steinway piano. Maestro Frank himself has given us permission to use his recordings, and I, for one, am thrilled beyond measure at the prospect of sharing them with you. Claude Frank is among the greatest and most distinguished pianists of his generation, someone who has appeared with virtually every major orchestra, at every major festival, and on the stage of every major concert hall on the planet. His Beethoven sonatas are spectacular, filled with passion, lyricism, wit, and extraordinary intelligence. When it first appeared in 1971, Time magazine called Frank's set, quote, one of the year's 10 best, unquote. Esquire magazine wrote that the set was, quote, among the great individual musical accomplishments of the last decade, unquote. High Fidelity magazine called it, quote, a splendidly executed, masterfully interpreted accomplishment, unquote. And the Saturday Review stated that Frank's complete Beethoven sonatas was, and again we quote, the most poetic series of performances to be recorded, unquote. As we're going to be literally living with, bedded down with Claude Frank for the next 23 lectures, I think it behooves us to know something about him. Claude Frank was born on December 24th of 1925 in Nuremberg, Germany. In 1937, his family escaped Germany and settled in Paris, where Frank studied at the Paris Conservatoire. In 1940, after the German invasion of France, the Frank family fled once again, first to a hideout in the Pyrenees Mountains, then to Portugal, and finally to the United States and New York City. It was in New York that Frank studied piano with the great Arthur Schnabel, and composing and conducting with Paul Dessau and Normand Lockwood at Columbia University. Maestro Frank served in the American military in the mid-1940s and became an American citizen in 1944. He made his recital debut in Times Hall in New York in 1947. He's currently a professor at the Yale School of Music and serves on the faculty of the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. Michael Steinberg writes in the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, and we quote, Frank is one of the most admired American pianists. His playing of Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and Brahms is outstanding for its warmth, its intellectual and musical strength, and for a penetrating intelligence, unquote. We are lucky indeed to have his complete recordings of the Beethoven piano sonatas as our essential resource. As we observed a few moments ago, Maestro Frank will be performing on a modern Steinway, an instrument the likes of which Beethoven could only dream about. In closing, let's make the aural, that's A-U-R-A-L, the aural transition from the forte pianos we've been hearing to this point of the lecture to a modern 9-foot-long, 7 1/3 octave Steinway concert grand, one of the most perfect combinations of art and science ever conceived and constructed by our species. We turn to the third and final movement of Beethoven's Piano Sonata in C minor, Opus 10, number 1 of 1798. First, let's hear the opening of its third movement played on a forte piano built in Vienna in 1815 by Beninius Seidner. And now Claude Frank playing on a modern Steinway. Please, please note that the modern piano will be tuned to a higher pitch than the forte piano. Oh my goodness, Beethoven would have loved that Steinway. Appetites properly whetted, we proceed. Thank you.